All right, so thank you very much for joining everyone today. So for today's webinar session, it is titled, What to Do When the Going Gets Tough, Effective Organizational Conflict Resolution Strategies and Procedures for Agencies. So this is part of a series of webinar sessions in the area of developing organizational capacity and knowledge in the area of human resources that I have and I will be running. So conflict resolution and mediation and management, it's an important issue for all agencies, regardless of size, type, location, how long they've been in existence, whatever. Whenever you have individuals and parties interacting, conflict can usually manifest itself in a variety of forms. But conflict resolution and management, it's not enough to have training at the individual level. There need to be some overarching structures, policies, and procedures to help manage and mitigate conflict, so it doesn't become a sort of a circular issue that goes deep, becomes deeply rooted in an organization. So this is the agenda I have set for today. So first I'm going to begin by going over some of the Orgwise voluntary standards in the area of human resources. This is how I'm going to be framing today's session as conflict resolution and management as part of promoting positive staff relations. Next, we're going to be talking about identifying and understanding conflict. What exactly is conflict? Why does it happen? Some of the sources of conflict in the workplace, and also, is conflict all a negative thing? Can it be seen as an opportunity for agencies and for individuals? Next, I'll be looking at strategies for addressing conflict in the workplace. So this is going to be looking at the micro level. So what individuals can do when interacting with their peers, with other groups, to help sort of navigate some of the barriers within the workplace related to conflict. And then finally, as I mentioned before, I want to talk about some of the policies and procedures that help to support effective conflict resolution and management. So talking about what exactly is the conflict management process and what policies and procedures are in place to help support conflict management as well. So here I have a list of some of the presentation takeaways I put together. So this is what I hope that everyone will be able to take away by the end of this presentation. So first, I want you to be able to understand OCASI's Orgwise voluntary standards within the area of human resources. Again, this is where the presentation on conflict resolution and management will be grounded in OCASI's Orgwise voluntary standards policy. Next, we want to understand how conflict resolution and management supports organizational development in order to promote positive staff relations climate. Next, we're going to be looking at some of the sources of conflict in the workplace. And finally, what are some important strategies for addressing and managing conflict in the workplace as well? And lastly, we're going to be connecting some of the policies and procedures that help to uphold and support a positive staff relations climate. So we're going to be looking at some of the policies related to conflict resolution and management. And so again, please be mindful for this presentation that there are a lot of issues that that surround conflict. So we can look at conflict resolution management from a variety of different ways. So we can look at it from a gender perspective. We can look at it in terms of cultural differentiation. We can look at it in terms of intergenerational conflict. But that could be many, many presentations in and of themselves. So for this presentation, we're going to try to look at it from the micro level and also the macro level. And please keep in mind that there are a lot of other issues and factors that we do need to consider when we kind of examine and address conflict resolution and management. So moving forward, I just actually want to take a little bit of time to talk about the Orgwise Organizational Standards Project. So it is an OCASI project, and it's actually one of the first of its kind from OCASI to address capacity building from at an organizational level. So what Orgwise is, it has a site component in which it is a knowledge hub for organizational development for OCASI member agencies and all agencies operating within the settlement and immigrant and refugee serving sector here in Ontario. With Orgwise, agencies are able to assess their strengths and also identify some of their opportunities to develop their organizational capacities using an online self-assessment. And this helps to measure capacity in 4 distinct areas. So we have a community-based approach, governance and strategic leadership, operations, and finally human resources. Now for human resources, this is going to be the area that I'm going to be focusing on for today's presentation. With the Orgwise Organizational Standards Project, agencies have access to a variety of different informative and valuable resources in both online and in-person formats. So these resources can take forms of webinars such as today, electronic resources such as policy templates, manuals, guidebooks. We also have a peer learning group, a mentorship initiative, and even a community of practice in which some users use it as an opportunity to collaborate with other settlement sector leaders and agencies. So I wanted to just pause for a moment and bring up the Orgwise website and try to give everyone a better idea of what I mean when I'm talking about when I talk about the Orgwise website and the human resources area of the standards. So here's the screen I'm talking about. When I talk about human resources on the Orgwise website, it's divided into a variety of categories. We have work environments, hiring, deployment, engagement, and retention, and then finally managing students and volunteers. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on a standard under work environment, which reads, our organization promotes a positive staff relations climate. And if everyone can see, there's actually a little scale beside the standard, which actually talks about how there's some legal ramifications and some legal implications for this standard. So it is actually quite important for agencies to bear that in mind as well. Going back to the presentation, we're actually going to go and talk about, again, focusing on this standard. So our organization promotes a positive staff relations climate. So this is, again, so this presentation will look specifically about what agencies can do to meet the standard in terms of addressing conflict through conflict resolution and management as well, as part of a way to kind of uphold and meet the standard, and also to show innovation. So when I talk about this Orgwise standard, some individuals may ask, well, what exactly does that mean, a positive staff relations climate? How do we know as an agency if we are meeting this standard, and what can we do to ensure that we actually are promoting a positive staff relations climate? So I wanted to pull together a few important indicators that actually speak directly to this standard, and these are also found on the Orgwise website that I just showed as well. So I pulled together 3 important standards what I feel speak directly to the issue of conflict resolution and management. So the first one is, our managers have mechanisms to facilitate open and honest communication with staff. Our organization has a complaints protocol that is fairly and consistently implemented. And then finally, our organization has policies and or guidelines to structure staff-to-staff and management-staff relations. So these indicators relate to how is information communicated and delivered to staff members, what policies and procedures are in place to sort of monitor and mitigate staff relations, and also point to the fact that there are certain policies and procedures that must be in place in order to provide individuals in the workplace with more structure so that they can ensure that they are getting the work done, and ultimately it's fulfilling on your agency's vision and mission. So moving forward to the meat of the presentation, so I just wanted to stop with talking about Orgwise. So when we move forward, when we're talking about positive staff relations and also looking at conflict resolution management, please be advised that I am framing this as part of the Orgwise Organizational Standards Initiative project here with OCASI. So keeping those indicators in mind when we move forward and we talk about nurturing positive staff relations. So again, we want to link when we talk about positive staff relations, we're talking about linking this to effective communication processes, and namely procedures for managing and addressing conflict. And this presentation, again, will look at conflict more in depth at both a micro and a macro level. So I wanted to actually begin by having a poll for everyone, because I'm very, very curious to sort of get a better understanding of your involvement or your experience with dealing with conflict in the workplace, whether it's indirectly or directly, and how is it affecting your work, or what percentage of the time do you feel that you are having to deal with conflict? So I'm going to be opening this poll. Just give me a moment. And I'll be launching a poll. So if everyone could just fill out the poll, I'm very, very curious to see what the response rate is. So how often do you find yourself involved in a conflict situation, whether directly or indirectly, in your work environment in a given week? So I'm really trying to get a better understanding of the frequency of conflict affecting those participating in this session. And also, this may shed some light on some of the different impressions or understandings of what we have as to what conflict may mean, and also how we interpret its prevalence, the different forms of conflict, how we can understand conflict, what shapes it takes in the workplace. And maybe by the end of the presentation, you may feel a bit differently. So please feel free to add to the poll. Okay, I see you have 90% voted. All right, so we're going to close that poll, and we're going to share the results online. All right, so we see overwhelmingly we have around 58% of individuals have reported 0 to 20% involvement, directly or indirect involvement with conflict in the workplace, which is actually really, really great. It's great to see that maybe already there's a lot of conflict management and resolution procedures in place already. We also have a few, 28%, say 21 to 40%, and then even 11%, 41 to 60% of individuals reporting that they have been directly or indirectly involved in conflict within the workplace. Thanks very much for your participation, everyone. So that's actually very, very important and interesting information, and I bet if I actually did this poll at the very end of the presentation, the numbers may change a little bit, because I do want to shed some light on trying to delve more into what exactly do we mean by what is conflict, how does it manifest itself, how do we identify conflict in the workplace, and also what can we do about that too. So let's move forward into getting to more landing on the same page in terms of understanding conflict. So as I mentioned before, conflict can be interpreted and defined very differently depending on your perspective, your experience with it. But for the sake of this presentation, I wanted to define it in terms of looking at affective and substantive conflict. But first, using a definition from Rahim, 2002, he states that conflict is an interactive process manifested in the incompatibility, disagreement, or dissonance within or between social entities, and this includes both individuals and groups, and it can stem from multiple sources. So the idea is that individuals or groups can be in conflict with one another, and also there are many, many different sources of conflict. John Burton also wants to differentiate between conflict and a dispute, which is also very, very important as well. So he states that disputes are short-term disagreements that are fairly easy to resolve. They don't take much time, energy, and they don't involve a lot of complex problem solving or the use of a strategy. But conflict can be more deep-rooted, they're more long-term, and they involve seemingly non-negotiable issues that are resistant to resolution. And also conflict can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, whether it is direct, subtle, or silent conflict, and circular conflict. So what do I mean by these different forms of conflict? Well, when we look at direct conflict, this is when all emotions are on the table. It's mostly present in the form of anger or frustration or excitement or sadness, and this is where direct conflict can quickly escalate into violent conflict, or one where physical harm can be involved. With subtle or silent conflict, it can be a little bit more difficult to detect in the fact that this conflict may be unacknowledged or unnoticed, and also may be avoided by other people and other individuals. It also manifests itself with withdrawal, individuals that use silence. Also, we can see it in the workplace in terms of perhaps poor attendance and resignation. With circular conflict, this is often a continual and escalating range of both deliberate and unconscious actions of individuals. And with circular conflict, it often inhibits the ability for individuals to actually get to the root of the problem. They may be trying to address some issues that may be on the surface, but those actually may not be the true source of conflict. It may be a much deeper, more complex underlying issue. And if this isn't addressed, it can obviously have people going in circles, and the same issues may be arising again and again. And again, as I mentioned, we can't understand conflict if we just look at it simply from the micro or the macro. We really do need to use a dual approach in that both individuals and organizations have a responsibility to address it at both levels. And then the effects of conflict are both tangible and intangible. That goes without saying that we can measure the effects of conflict within economic terms or values, social, political, but I'm actually going to be getting to the effects in a few slides from now. Let's look more at what are some of the sources of conflict in the workplace. Now, I know that these are just 6 areas, and there are probably many, many more than 6 sources of conflict. But with conflict in the workplace, I want to focus on these 6 areas because this is where policies, procedures, and staff training can help to effectively manage and mitigate conflict within the workplace. And so some examples of some sources of conflict that may be within the workplace, but they may be outside the scope of some procedures or policies could be, for example, environmental factors or environmental sources where we may not have as much control over. So for this presentation, I just want to focus on these 6 areas, and of course there are others. So when we look at information and education, there's an interesting Chinese proverb which goes, there's your truth, my truth, and the truth. And so it's our interpretation of information, education, and what is important, what constitutes important information, what is not important information, and even a lack of information or misinformation. This is also in terms of a lack of education, or we may be educated or feel that we are informed, but really we may not be informed about the right subject matter. With communication, this is when individuals can feel as though they are lost in translation, as though they're hitting a brick wall when they're trying to communicate or interact with one another or another group. Also, this can also relate to there's a lack of appropriate vehicles for communicating with other individuals and with groups as well. And with communication, this is also the case where people may misinterpret ideas and perspectives. People can become very defensive, or they also may assume certain factors or stereotype others. With resources, I'm really talking about it's a question of access and control and ownership here. So are individuals able to access the resources that they need? Is it a question of conflict over certain resources or limited resources, or anticipating future needs for resources which may or may not be there, or there may not be the supporting mechanisms to access those resources as well? Lastly, we have interest. So I'm not really talking about, I guess conflict of interest could fall under here, but really when we talk about interest, it's concerning the underlying personal needs or goals that each person has that he or she sees as critical to their well-being. So these sort of interest conflicts can arise because there may be a perception that there are different interests that are actually in competition with one another, or certain interests need to crest to the top where others may need to be cast aside in order to fulfill on achieving a goal, for example. And we also have structural conflicts. So this can also be understood as the balance of power, and even a lack of structure can be a source of conflict as well. When we talk about structure, we're also talking about the decision-making process. Who gets to decide the process that's being used? Is the process fair? What about responsibility and task management? How do we work with authority or other powerful individuals or groups in order to work out solutions to complex problems? And then values. I guess the most basic way of understanding values is it's ideology in the broadest sense. So how do we see the world? How do those views get projected and taken by others? And are our values in conflict with some of the values of other individuals, or maybe in conflict with some of the other sources of conflict as well? So now we've looked at 6 sources of conflict within the workplace, but I want to talk a little bit about, well, what is the impact of conflict in the workplace? And I'm assuming that some of the impacts of conflict can be pretty easily understood, yet conflict is still something that happens, that can be happening quite frequently. So I think one of the first ones that we can all agree on is low staff morale. No one likes being in the center of conflict. I guess maybe some people may argue differently, but conflict does take a really, really major toll on individuals. And it also inhibits worker productivity. If you feel that individuals are constantly in conflict, or you feel that you need to be focused on attending to conflict and managing and mitigating conflict, you're taken away from the project or the task that you actually need to be performing. And again, this actually should be a really, really major concern for a lot of agencies, because ultimately with lower productivity, your agency will not be able to fulfill on its vision and mission. So when the work is interrupted, the whole mission and vision of your agency is also interrupted as well. When we look at worker absenteeism and sick leave, so individuals that take time off or fall ill as a result of stress due to conflict, we're also not talking about simply a physical absence from work, but also even a mental absence, the idea of what can be called as presenteeism, where we have individuals that illustrate a lack of dedication to the work, a lack of enthusiasm, doing the absolute bare minimum. There may be also a lack of investment in the work or a sense of boredom. And also, this also impacts on the idea that perhaps the work isn't that important. Perhaps there are better things to do as well. So we can also think of it as workers have mentally, quote-unquote, checked out. We also have employee loss and turnover, and this should actually be a really also major concern, because within the settlement and immigrant serving sector here in Ontario, we do have an issue of succession within the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of individuals will be retiring from the sector, so where are the new generation of employees going to come from? If they're coming into a very, very high stress situation where there is a lot of conflict, if they aren't staying there, what will be the future, the fate of a lot of these agencies, and your agency as well? Again, the idea that conflict can escalate and there can be violence or harm involved. The authorities may also have to be involved as well. And also, ultimately damage organizational reputation and credibility. This can actually be one of the most difficult measures of conflict, but it can actually be one of the most damaging as well. If your agency or organization is known as this being a systemic and problematic and ongoing issue, it could impact the ability of your agency to collaborate with other agencies, funding, for example, also even just public perception as well, and it may impact on your ability to effectively serve your communities as well and your stakeholders. And again, the cost of failing to address conflict, it goes beyond economic measures or simply dollar signs. We can look at it in terms of social, political, cultural, even, for example, looking at an organization's reputation and credibility. It can be very, very difficult to put a dollar amount on that, but it is something that is recognized that once credibility or reputation is damaged, it does have some negative, very, very negative implications. So let's move forward. I actually wanted to introduce another poll for you guys. I know, keep this interactive and keep it lively. So I wanted to ask, how strongly do you feel, or do you agree or disagree with this statement that, quote, conflict is an inherently negative and crippling force that represents few benefits or opportunities for agencies? So let me just open the poll. I'm very, very curious to see, and feel free to answer. So again, conflict is an inherently negative and crippling force that represents few benefits or opportunities for agencies. So this can be based on your personal experiences, how conflict management or resolution is dealt with in your workplace. Is there a time when you think it may be beneficial for agencies? Or was there a time when you experienced being in the middle of a conflict or a situation where there was conflict involved, but actually represented an opportunity? So we have about 63% of individuals have voted so far, so please feel free to take some more time. All right, I'll close the poll in just a few, like maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Still waiting on a few individuals to answer. All right, so it seems that we're at an 85%, 88% actually answer rate. So I'm going to close the poll now. I'm going to share the poll with everyone. So very interesting numbers we have here. So we have 17% strongly agree with the statement, represents few benefits or opportunities for agencies. 28% agree. 14% are very neutral. 33% disagree with the statement. And then finally, 8% strongly disagree with the statement. So it's very, very interesting that even with the range of disagreement and agreement with the following statements. So with the next slide, I actually want to go to continue the presentation and maybe try to flip that on its head, that conflict is inherently negative, and maybe there is something that we have to gain from managing conflict in the workplace and learning from it as well. So I want to look at conflict as opportunity. Now, for a lot of individuals or for some agencies, this seems to be an oxymoron, that conflict is not opportunity. But when I talk about conflict as opportunity, I'm actually framing it as substantive conflict. And it's interesting because a lot of the research I've come across during the course of researching for this webinar topic, they actually have pointed to the fact that conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it really comes down to how conflict is effectively managed and mitigated at a macro level. So I talk about substantive conflict, and really is talking about how agencies harness and mitigate conflict, how agencies can use different ideas, perspectives, and opinions to their advantage. So really, this is related to function and task. So we can see this as having ramifications on the individual or micro level, but also on the macro level as well. So scholars have stated, according to Rahim as well, that effectively managed conflict can lead to increased learning. So for example, when individuals have the necessary procedures and supports in place, they can actually incorporate improved reasoning, thinking and inquiry, and also critical analysis. They have the ability to better analyze situations as well. And also it leads to questioning assumptions in the status quo, that we don't take things or procedures for granted, but we actually have questions about, well, why are these procedures in place? Is this the best fit for our agency? Or maybe something that worked 5 years ago, maybe that's no longer appropriate. So it's having these difficult conversations sometimes that may actually lead to conflict, but it's for the purpose of critical analysis and actually furthering discussion and innovation in an area. So again, it's using the idea of using a new perspective and new approaches for issues that agencies, when they actually are able to incorporate thinking inquiry in response to conflicts, that they will be able to innovate and gain a competitive advantage. Oh, I'm just getting a question right now from a user regarding if you'll be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. You will be sent a version of the PowerPoint slides and the archived webinar with the recording within 48 hours of the broadcast. Just a reminder as well, it will be available on the Orgwise Organizational Standards website at www.orgwise.ca. Thank you for your question. Going back to conflict as opportunity, so I want agencies to kind of understand conflict to be a new lens for framing it, and that ultimately it accounts for opportunities to positively impact organizational structure and organizational culture. Just wanted to take some time now. Does anyone have any questions regarding any of the subject matter so far, or anything that I've said up until this point regarding perhaps Orgwise or some of the issues surrounding how we understand conflicts? Again, please remember that there are obviously many, many other factors when we're looking at conflict. I really did want to use these frames for the presentation because, again, we could look at conflict from a variety of perspectives that could be webinar presentations in and of themselves. Does anyone have any comments about this slide? Do you think conflict is an opportunity, or do you still think it could be potentially very, very damaging? Or maybe it's the fact that if policies and procedures are in place, that's when the damage can occur. Okay, I have one interesting question here regarding what's the best way to assess conflict in the workplace. And actually, this is a very, very interesting question. I'm actually going to be getting to this point a bit later, and it talks about identifying some strategies that people use to address conflict in the workplace, but also what kind of procedures are in place to ensure that there are open communication policies and that there's trust built in between individuals, that they can actually voice their concerns or are there mechanisms in place that they can actually raise issues to management, to their peers, or to other parties involved? So actually, I'm going to be getting to that question a little bit later, if you just hang tight for a few more slides. Oh, I have another question just regarding the definition of conflict. So again, for the sake of this presentation, I've used a definition according to Rahim, 2002, a scholar. Conflict as an interactive process that's manifested in the incompatibility, disagreement, or dissonance within or between social identities, including individuals and groups, and that conflict can stem from multiple sources. Also, that conflict is different from a dispute, in that disputes are relatively short-term disagreements that are relatively easy to resolve, and they don't require a strategy in terms of adopting a certain style or identifying the issue at hand. Whereas conflict can take, it's more of a deep-rooted problem that at first glance may be seemingly involving non-negotiable issues and can take place between individuals or groups or parties. So thank you for your question. So I have one last question. How do you ask leaders in an organization to address conflict in a positive, constructive way? Sometimes managers take sides in conflict, and that leads to more frustration and low morale. That's actually a very, very valid point. That's a really, really good question. And I'm going to be looking at some of the different strategies in the next coming slides. Well, what can we be doing within the workplace? So if you just hang tight a little bit, we're going to actually be addressing that as well in the next coming slides. And that actually, that answer looks at both at a micro level and a macro level. So what policies and procedures can we develop or should be developed to help mitigate conflict so that it is seen as positive and constructive, but also involving training staff and personnel on these policies and procedures so that they can be better able to identify appropriate strategies for mitigating and dealing with conflict, and also utilizing conflict as part of a means to innovate and also incorporate critical analysis. So very, very great questions. I will be getting to those in a few slides, so just hang tight for a little bit longer. Thanks very much for your questions, guys. All right. So let's look at addressing conflict in the workplace. And based on, I'm sure at least at one time or another, everyone has been involved in a conflict situation, again, whether directly or indirectly. Well, when we look at this section, again, please bear in mind that conflict is both affective, which is talking a lot more about the emotional aspects and relationship aspect of conflict, and substantive, and that's related to task management, performance, responsibility, and the decision-making process. So keep that in mind when we look at conflict as well in the next coming slides from that angle. So let's talk about conflict resolution styles. So before I get into this area, I want to mention that there's absolutely no right or wrong style, and that individuals should be using and coming to rely on styles at some point. And the key is matching the appropriate style to the situation. I'm going to be getting a little bit into the conflict resolution process in another slide, but first I want to actually talk about these styles and that they are all effective in and of themselves if appropriately matched with the situation. So I don't want anyone to think that, oh, I see avoidance, that must be a bad thing, versus cooperation style, that obviously means that has to be the go-to style. It's all about identifying and understanding what style you should be using and matching it with the appropriate situation. So let's go through them and talk about them a little bit more. So first we have the avoidance style. So this is characterized by inaction or passivity. So this is where individuals have reduced concerns for their own outcomes and the outcomes of others. So people may understand the style to be, well, conflict isn't being addressed, it's actually, we're prolonging it. But we can actually kind of flip that on its head and say that this may actually be using a wait-and-see approach. Maybe there are times when a cooling off period is necessary, or that the environment is not appropriate or suitable for effectively addressing the conflict at hand. Also, this is a really good style to use when the issue is very trivial, or the potential dysfunctional effect of confronting another party far outweighs the benefits of a resolution. And we have to remember that that may in and of itself be a resolution. So yielding It's also known as accommodating. So this is when it's characterized by having a high concern for others and a low concern for self. And what I mean by that, I mean that individuals derive personal satisfaction from meeting the needs of others, and they really hold a general concern of maintaining stable, positive, and social relationships. In the end, being agreeable is more important than winning an argument or winning, so to speak. So this style is good if you feel that you actually may be in the wrong, if you want to give up something in exchange for something from the other party in the future, so you can think of it in strategic matters as well, or if you feel that the issue is more important to the other party, and it's really not worth the time investing time and energy into having a conflict potentially escalate as well. Competitive. So this is when individuals are maximizing their individual assertiveness. Some individuals associate with this a win or lose mentality, but this actually is a really, really useful style when an important decision needs to be made immediately, or if also there's an unpopular course of action that must be implemented as well. It also is a very, very interesting style to use if you feel very, very strongly in the belief of something, or as well, and you need to really express that point to another party as well. Cooperation. So this is it looks like a very, very sort of friendly, like the go-to style. But if we look at it more in depth, this is actually the cooperation style. It's more for complex problem solving. A lot of openness, time and energy and resources need to be invested in utilizing this style in order to address the conflict at hand as well. So again, this is very, very useful for dealing with complex problems where synthesis is required to come up with a solution, and that we can look at cooperation style as sort of like some of the systemic underlying conflicts within an organization or between two parties. You can also look at it in terms of if the issue is a strategic issue, or it pertains to an organization's objectives, missions, and policies as well. Cooperation styles sometimes not appropriate when other parties or the other individuals involved don't really have a lot invested in the outcome of the situation, or perhaps they may not have the appropriate problem-solving skills, and that can be for a variety of reasons as well. And also, cooperation style may not be as most effective if an immediate decision is required as well. And lastly, we have conciliation style. This is really a give-and-take approach. And so this is a very, very interesting style to use when the goals of both parties are mutually exclusive, or if both parties are of equal power and they have reached an impasse. Some scholars have cited that conciliation usually is one of the primary steps in actually reaching cooperation, that if it is a complex issue, perhaps a temporary solution needs to be made until both parties are ready to be engaged in cooperation style and setting aside more time and resources to deal with a more complex issue. So we've looked at a little bit of the resolution styles, but let's look about what is the process. How do we actually go through with addressing conflicts, keeping in mind that these styles are all appropriate for the conflict resolution process as well. So first, the stage one is problem recognition and problem sensing. So with problem sensing, we actually need to know, is there an actual conflict? Maybe there's something that we aren't aware of. And this is where it's very, very important to have processes and policies in place that can support open communication and trust. So for example, a good idea is an open door policy in an agency. Also with problem sensing, we need to be aware of a lot of other factors at play, and also being able to check your assumptions or check your stereotypes about a given situation. Being able to objectively step back and look at a situation holistically. With problem formulation, we need to identify the appropriate problem and focus on the actual problem at hand. What may at first may appear to be the conflict may actually not be the source of the conflict. So again, this is not supposed to be a one-time, quick 2-minute sort of step. It really does require individuals to really step back and look at consulting perhaps with other individuals, or really taking time to really think about, well, what exactly is the problem at hand, and how do we actually frame the conflict and the root of it. Next, we want to plan for change. And so we first want to recommend solutions. This is where it's very, very important to be utilizing the resources that you have. So for example, you want to be able to rely on the right stakeholders, ones that can be knowledgeable and give objective advice. Expand your options. Don't frame the conflict too small. You want to be able to expand the boundaries so that you can bring in other options and resources as well. We also want to phrase problems correctly. So be very, very aware of language when it comes to recommending solutions as well, and also extend the scope of the solutions. Next, we want to prepare for the intervention. So again, the key for this is remaining objective and open, and it may involve negotiation. This is where it's very, very important to be aware of environmental factors or other sort of mitigating factors that may come into play, or they may aggravate a situation, or they may assist in addressing a conflict as well. Again, it comes down to how we frame conflict. So for example, if we look at an individual that's not performing to task, perhaps one may assume that it may be out of laziness or disinterest in the work, but maybe it's actually there's not enough supports or mechanisms to support that individual in task completion. So it's appealing to looking at more of a macro perspective as well, and that it may not just be an individual issue, but also what role does an organization and policies and procedures come into play. Next, we want to have implementation. So we want to actually put the plans into action. And this is when we actually are matching the appropriate style with the issue at hand, or the situation as well. And this is when it's very, very important to remain objective and also be aware of the emotions of another individual. Also being aware that what may at first appear as substantive conflict or something related to task management or responsibility, another individual or party may interpret that in terms of affective conflict. It may be related to emotions, or it may feel like as if they need to be on the defensive or that you are attacking them. And lastly, we want to review the outcomes. Well, what was the outcome of your plan and putting into action? Was it the appropriate action? What can you take away for next time? Should you be debriefing about it? And also referring to what policies and procedures are already in place that can help kind of mitigate the conflict resolution process as well. So when we look at conflict resolution, I just want to quickly mention a few best practices. So again, we want to be looking at conflict not just at the individual level, but also at the organizational level. Some scholars refer to this as using a double loop process, that you're examining an issue about both the micro and the macro. Be aware of power dynamics. It can be very intimidating if, as an employee, you are called into a supervisor's office to discuss a conflict or an issue. And that may play into how effectively or ineffective the conflict is addressed. Again, looking at the influence of environmental factors, if a conflict took place in a boardroom, for example, maybe within the next 5 minutes trying to address that conflict within the same location may not be as appropriate as well. Check your assumptions. Check your stereotypes or those sort of assumptions that you may have about the situation or the individual or party that are involved. And know that minor conflicts can quickly escalate, and they can also be part of minor conflicts are also may be part of circular conflict as well. So there may be a much more deeper root or heart of the matter. The importance of debriefing after a major incident, giving everyone and staff the opportunity to express and process their emotions whenever a major incident happens. This is when effective conflict may be likely to emerge if individuals feel that they do not have enough or adequate support to deal with their emotions about a situation. And also, it enables individuals to ask for additional support if they need it. And finally, acknowledge that everyone has a role to play and a responsibility to address an issue regarding conflict, because it very, very seldom stays within two parties or two individuals, and it can really become an agency-wide issue and affect a lot more other individuals. So it does have a ripple effect. Do we have any questions about some of the conflict resolution or best practices? I know we only went over a few of the styles and trying to identify an appropriate resolution process. So this is based on the research that I have done, and obviously there are a lot of other factors that we need to take into consideration. such as legal ramifications, gender, culture. We can examine that from a wide variety of factors, but the conflict resolution process, it is quite stable and actually quite fairly agreed upon within among scholars and scholarly circles. There was the comment before about how do we frame conflict as a positive, as something constructive, and going back to the conflict resolution process, it's again how do we formulate the problem and how do we communicate that with other parties involved. Well, I have a really good question. How do you move away from policy to practice? And this is actually a very, very interesting question because policies will help to influence organizational culture and ultimately practices of employees and staff members. But we need to also be aware that organizational culture can also influence policies. So really when you come to policies and practice, it involves staff training and being aware and objective, and also regularly reviewing and monitoring policies as well. Actually, with that question, that brings me to the next set of slides, and I'm actually going to be pointing to a few policies and procedures that should be in place at your agency that can help to mitigate and effectively manage conflict resolution and conflict within the workplace. So hang to that question. That's a really, really good question. All right. So let's go to how do we manage conflict through policies and procedures. And I really, really like this graphic because it's the idea that having something on paper or written in a book or on a binder may not be enough, that, again, individuals and staff members need to be trained on addressing conflict and conflict resolution. And how do we manage it? It's not enough to simply have a policy or procedure in place, as someone raised the issue of how do we move from policy and procedure to actually putting it into action. So hopefully I can get to that right now. So let's go a bit more into it. So when we look at policies and procedures, we need to be aware that there is legislation that is linked to supporting a positive staff relations climate. And for the sake of this presentation, I just focused on Ontario legislation. There is also legislation at the federal level as well that we all need to be aware of. So for example, we have the Employment Standards Act, which its mission is to promote fairness in the workplace for all of Ontarians. And so Employment Standards Act involves issues such as sick leave, pay, and what have you. We also have Employment Equity Act. So this is talking about how to traditionally marginalized groups and disadvantaged groups, how can they be proactive and be involved and actual members of in the workplace. So this focuses on women, individuals with disabilities, Aboriginal people, as the Act states, or First Nations peoples, and also visible minorities. I have a question right here. I'm going to take a quick pause. So it's talking about the fear of rocking the boat and being able to. All right. So we have because of being aware of power dynamics in the organization. How do you feel? How does that play a role in addressing conflict? So again, it is very, very. That's a really, really good question. That obviously with power dynamics between staff and staff, or management, or even if we look at individuals that have been with an organization for a long time and may have seniority, it can be very, very difficult for some individuals if they do have a situation that they need to address or a conflict that they want to address. And this really comes down to, again, sort of the idea of formulating the problem and also having policies and procedures that encourage open and fair communication, policies and procedures that everyone is trained equally on. And it comes down to a question of leadership, that from the very, very top of the organization to everyone that falls underneath, everyone needs to be fairly trained on policies and procedures for managing conflict in an organization, but also being aware that if individuals have issues or want to give feedback, how is that collected? How does that come into play? What mechanisms are in place to solicit the feedback of individuals, and also how is that incorporated as well? So it's a very, very good question. Thank you. Moving on to just continuing the slide about legislation. So we also have how employers are required, again, by law to institute positive policies and practices. So again, this directly feeds into the idea of promoting a positive staff relations climate is linked to legislation. And finally, we have the Ontario Human Rights Code. So this is the idea of preventing discrimination and harassment. And as we can see, understand that some harassment or discrimination can be as a result of conflict, or it can actually be the product of conflict as well. So it's very, very important to address that. Moving on, let's look at the conflict management process. So I know before I spoke about the conflict resolution process, so that kind of looked at it more on a micro level, while also being aware of some of the macro factors. But let's look at it, what can an agency do? So first, again, as I mentioned, effective conflict management means that individuals and agencies need to take an active leadership role. Diagnosis. So first we begin with diagnosis. So it's not enough to say that, oh, no one's raised any concerns about conflict, therefore everything must be peachy, everyone must be getting along okay. This involves actually taking a SWOT analysis. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as well. So it's looking at the nature of a problem, and then again, it comes down to expanding your boundaries and scope. If we want to look at the idea that perhaps there's very cordial relations between employees, that affective conflict is managed quite well, but what about substantive conflict? What are the ways of individuals have issues, or they have new ideas or perspectives about ways of doing things that can be improved? How do we actually, what mechanisms are in place to kind of capture those ideas and use those ideas as well? So for the intervention, this comes down to leadership, culture, and design. So again, what policies are in place, what policies need to be developed, and training. How are we going to be training individuals and staff equally so that they can be aware of these policies and know how to utilize them as well? This also comes to the question is there a need for an intervention? If so, well, what type of intervention is required? And really, it can also come down to how can agencies ensure that individuals and staff members are trained on identifying conflict, the sources of conflict, identifying appropriate styles for conflict resolution, and then matching those styles to conflict as well. That will actually go a long way for promoting improved and positive staff relations within the workplace. The idea of conflict, it can also be minimized through organizational culture. So this can take different forms of team building or likewise. Oh, I have a question. It's regarding the actual use of the word diagnosis versus the word assessment. For this, the conflict management process, this is actually also taken from my research. So I guess diagnosis, it actually kind of speaks to, I like the word diagnosis because, again, it relates to the health of one's agency. You can kind of understand it in terms of taking a sort of a 360-degree look. So just as if you go to the doctor to get a physical where the doctor will inspect and check you out on everything, run various types of tests, we can actually kind of see a diagnosis as sort of the exact way that you kind of go for the doctor for a full physical checkup. And also, it's the idea of diagnosis that this is an organic process that is constantly changing and morphing, that is not stagnant or once, it is a continuous process that needs to be regularly reviewed and monitored. It shouldn't be a one-off, and it shouldn't be left to a few individuals to take part of. That everyone should be trained as well, and everyone has a part to play. That's a very, very good question. Thank you. So going back to intervention, so there's a few types of interventions that we can take. There's intervention in terms of addressing conflict through organizational culture. Again, that's like so for example, team building exercises, training on anti-oppression policies, promoting positive relations with perhaps a staff committee, or structural. So how do we change structural design and characteristics? So this can include a reward and merit system based on work. How do we reward and celebrate the work of employees? The ideas surrounding hierarchy, and then changing the design so that's not a one-fits-all. So again, this can also, it relates back to whatever fits in with your organization. Perhaps a more bureaucratic structure is needed if there are many, many levels or many individuals, or maybe it needs to be more responsive and then also more organic as well. So we look at conflict, we're actually looking at the amount of conflict, both effective and substantive, how it manifests itself in agencies as well, and among individuals and parties, and what are some of the kind of prevalent or prevailing conflict styles among groups or individuals at an organization as well. And then we have learning and effectiveness. So this is talking about individual, group, and organizational learning, and also comes back to the idea about debriefing. So then when an incident or a conflict arises, that there are opportunities for individuals to share their emotions as well, so that we really don't get into a long, so that if affective conflict does not go and take a hold on an organization as well. And then finally, we have feedback. So again, what systems are in place to collect feedback, ensure robust participation, and also monitor processes? I have one actually very, very interesting question. It reads, how do you build capacity for conflict management in your organization if you're not in a position of leadership to drive policies and procedures? That's a very, very good question. And this actually involves having a conversation, an honest conversation, an objective conversation, and where you can raise your concerns and feedback. There are actually a lot of resources on the Orgwise website that actually speak directly to that issue at hand. And a lot of the research that I have done, it actually also touches on what to do if you're not in a position of leadership, though you feel that there is something that needs to be addressed or an underlying conflict that needs to be addressed. You're not quite sure how to do that. So that's a very, very great question. And I'm actually going to be pointing to some of the resources that will be online on the Orgwise website. And also, I will be uploading all of the research I've done for today's presentation as well. So thank you very much for that question. So to wrap things up, so this is some of the conflict management strategy must-have. So first and foremost, agencies need to be managing minimizing effective conflict at various levels. So because we know that emotions can limit information processing, how objective individuals can be, and it can aggravate stress levels or lead to conflict escalation, we need to find ways in which individuals and their policies in place that we can manage effective conflict. Providing forums for individuals to share their emotions and also express their frustrations and anger in a productive way as well. Also, we need to be able to moderate a modest amount of substantive conflict. So again, this relates to how your agency can be constantly innovating, capitalizing on these new ideas, new perspectives, and monitoring processes so that you don't find yourself stuck as well. You can always be on the leading edge as well. Again, being able to identify appropriate conflict resolution styles and matching these styles and strategies with situations and resolutions as well. Ensure that there's training provided for staff to identify these styles as well and match. And also including long-term provisions and ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And this should be something that should be available for all individuals. So whether it's how agencies can collect feedback and do sort of a 360-degree checkup, it needs to go beyond simply management, that, again, acknowledging that everyone has a role and responsibility to play. So lastly, I just want to talk about, before we wrap up, just a few policies that are connected to effective conflict management and resolution. And again, there are more resources relating to these specific policies on the Orgwise website, in which you are more than, please feel free to consult them at your leisure. So first and foremost, a staff code of conduct. So this should be related to your agency's guiding principles. And some important components of a staff code of conduct can be such as professionalism, privacy concerns, confidentiality, or even how do agencies deal with conflict of interest. An internal staff communications policy. This is very, very key as agencies are utilizing a variety of different vehicles for communicating with one another, such as email, face-to-face, telephone, written, in person, or even how our meetings facilitated as well. Ensuring that there are the appropriate channels for constructive criticism and feedback, and also being aware that individuals should not be reprimanded if they are attempting to make a constructive criticism or have something that they feel would further the agency as well. And even last, this is also very, very important, a staff grievance procedure. So identifying what are the criteria for to qualify as a grievance, what's the reporting procedure, who are individuals responsible to report to, the decision and action. So again, the investigation of the incident, what disciplinary action will take place, is there an opportunity for an appeal process, or mediation. So for example, alternative dispute resolution could be one form of mediation where an outside party is involved as well. And again, these are all detailed in much greater detail on the Orgwise website as well. But as I acknowledge, I am not an expert in this field. I simply just wanted to compile a lot of research that I feel would be useful. There are actually plenty of agencies that can offer even more resources for you, such as the HR Council for the nonprofit sector. Imagine Canada has some really, really great resources in the area of human resources and promoting positive and safe staff relations. The Ontario Ministry of Labour, because you should be consulting with the laws and if there have been any amendments. And also Idea Encore Network. This is actually an online knowledge hub for agencies that they can actually utilize a lot of and locate a lot of policy documents, procedures documents, workbooks, guidebooks, etc. So I really do encourage you to look at those. And then lastly, we have a variety of sample Orgwise resources. So these are resources that are already on the Orgwise site at www.orgwise.ca that you can access right away. That will actually, and you can implement them in your agency to begin addressing conflict resolution and management processes. Just wanted to quickly go over these references I included for the presentation, and these will also be available online as well. Are there any final questions before we wrap up today? I know it was quite a lot of information to digest, and I do appreciate your patience and also your great questions. It's been a very, very great, robust discussion. I really, really do appreciate your feedback. Anything else? Any other lingering questions before we end today's presentation? Please feel free also, if you do have comments, questions, or your feedback, I really, really do welcome your feedback. Please feel free to post it on the Orgwise Community of Practice under the Forums tab on orgwise.ca. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. I really, really do appreciate it. I hope that you have been able to take away a few things from this presentation. I know that I've learned a lot, and I've also, hopefully you'll be able to use some of these strategies or these ideas to help kind of facilitate the conversation for conflict resolution and management at your agency as well. I also encourage you, please sign up for an Orgwise account if you do not have one or if your agency does not have one. By logging onto the Orgwise site and clicking the Join Now tab. And also be aware that the presentation will be sent to you within 48 hours along with the accompanying slides. Oh, I have a really good question about where on the site can we find the resources. You don't need a password to locate the resources on the Orgwise site. They're located under the Human Resources area. But to access the standard how your agency promotes a positive staff relations climate and the indicators, you will need a login to access those standards. So I really do encourage you request a password and a login, and then you'll be able to examine the standards in much more detail as well. And then you'll also be able to explore some of the other human resources standards. Thanks very much, everyone. I look forward to hopefully connecting with you all in 1 month for the next Human Resources webinar. Thanks very much and have a very wonderful day.